It was a crisp morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of morning where the air felt sharp with anticipation, as if the very city itself was holding its breath. Outside the Capitol Media Forum Hall, the line of attendees stretched around 2 full city blocks. Security was tighter than usual. Reporters in navy blue suits and oversized press badges clutched cameras and microphones. They knew something was going to happen. They just didn't know what. Inside, the room buzzed. Over 700 people filled the velvet-draped chamber, a mix of journalists, political aides, activists, and students. Every seat was taken. Every camera was live-streaming. Banners for Free Press and Fair Questions 2025 hung along the walls. At center stage sat a modest table with 4 name placards. 3 of them were filled. The 4th was still empty. At precisely 9:30 a.m. she walked in. Karoline Leavitt, former White House Assistant Press Secretary, rising star in American politics, unapologetic defender of conservative values, dressed in a navy blazer with a simple American flag pin and holding nothing but a notepad, she didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't wave. She sat down quietly, adjusted the mic, and waited. To her right sat moderator Leslie Creighton, a long-time MSNBC contributor known more for viral gotcha moments than balanced journalism. She wore her trademark grin, part curious, part condescending. As the moderator shuffled her cue cards, she leaned over to Karoline and whispered something. Karoline didn't react. The crowd sensed the energy shift. Even those who didn't particularly like her leaned forward in their chairs. And then it began. "Good morning, everyone," Leslie said into the mic. "We're thrilled to welcome Karoline Leavitt. As many of you know, Karoline's had a, let's call it, colourful relationship with the press." Scattered laughter. Karoline sat still. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her hands didn't move. She waited. Leslie continued, "Karoline, you once said, and I quote, 'The media no longer informs, it performs.' Can you tell this audience what you meant by that? Or was that just another viral one-liner for your base?" A hush fell. The first punch had been thrown. Karoline reached slowly for the microphone, and what she said next would start a chain reaction that no one in the room, not even the smug moderator, could have anticipated. Karoline leaned into the mic with a calm that somehow made the room even quieter. She didn't look at Leslie. She looked straight ahead, as if speaking to something bigger than the forum, maybe to the people watching online, maybe to the moment itself. "You know what's funny, Leslie?" she began, her voice steady but edged with steel. "The truth doesn't need a performance, it just needs a mic." And with that single sentence, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. There was a beat of silence, then murmurs, then something no one expected at this early point in the event, a ripple of clapping, light at first, then growing. People looked around at one another, unsure if they were witnessing a moment of clarity or the beginning of something viral. Leslie shifted in her seat, blinking more rapidly now. "Well, that's catchy," she said, attempting to regain control. "But truth is subjective, isn't it? Especially in politics. Especially in your politics." Karoline didn't flinch. "Truth isn't a prop," she replied. "And if you need ratings to believe in something, it's not journalism, it's theatre." A second wave of clapping followed, louder this time. And this time it wasn't just the older veterans in the back or the college interns in the front row. It was nearly everyone. Even a few rival reporters looked impressed, if reluctantly so. Leslie raised her eyebrows, trying to smile, but clearly caught off guard. Okay, let's keep it civil," she said, laughing nervously. But Karoline wasn't done. "Civility starts with honesty," she said, her voice rising just enough. "And for too long, we've let press rooms become dressing rooms and headlines become scripts. I'm here to talk policy, not pose for sound bites." The clapping became applause, sustained, strong. Someone stood up in the third row and shouted, "Let her speak!" That did it. From backstage, a producer urgently whispered into Leslie's earpiece, but Leslie was frozen. Her grip on her cue cards tightened. Her formula was unraveling, and for the first time in her on-screen career, she was not in control of the narrative. Karoline calmly opened her notepad and said, "Since you brought it up, let's talk about what the media got wrong this year. I have a list." The crowd burst, and just like that, the microphone had become a spotlight. Karoline flipped open her notepad with the composure of someone who had rehearsed nothing and yet knew exactly what she was going to say. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture wildly. She simply read. 1. The border is secure, she began, looking up only briefly. That's what you reported, while thousands of Americans watched footage that said otherwise. There was a low hum in the crowd. Some heads nodded, others froze. 2, she continued. The economy is strong. That's what your headline said the same week 200 small businesses in the Midwest shut down. She paused. 3, school board protests were labelled extremist threats. Parents, not criminals, not terrorists. Parents trying to speak at open meetings. Leslie interjected nervously. Okay, Karoline, I think we're... But Karoline didn't stop. Her voice grew louder, sharper, like a scalpel slicing through layers of theatre. 4. When the laptop story broke, it was dismissed as disinformation. No retractions, no apologies, just silence. Convenient silence. Now the audience was fully engaged. Phones were out, filming. Someone whispered to a colleague, "This is going viral." The room had shifted from press conference to public reckoning. Leslie tried to speak again, but Karoline raised one hand, and astonishingly the moderator paused. 5. You ran editorials calling faith a weapon. You mocked Americans for praying after tragedies, and then had the audacity to preach about tolerance the next day. A loud clap echoed from the side of the hall, followed by another and another. Karoline closed the notepad slowly. I didn't come here to attack anyone, she said. I came here to remind this country of something you can't fake on a teleprompter. Truth doesn't trend, it endures. The applause was now thunderous. People were on their feet. Cameras shook with the intensity of the moment. A few of the older reporters in the front row just looked stunned, unsure whether to keep typing or put their hands together. Leslie leaned forward, trying to salvage control. But Karoline, don't you think that list is a little cherry-picked? Karoline finally turned to her, and with one eyebrow raised, she delivered the quote that would define the entire event. I don't cherry-pick, Leslie. I just read aloud what you won't. The room exploded. Standing ovation. Reporters who had prepared takedown tweets were now fumbling with their phones, unsure if they should post or delete. Even backstage staff could be seen peeking out from behind curtains, mouths slightly agape. In that moment, one sentence had cut through months of spin, clickbait, and commentary, and Karoline hadn't even raised her voice. The applause thundered on. It wasn't polite or procedural. It was visceral. The kind of applause people give, not for a person, but for a release. For someone saying what everyone else had been afraid to. Karoline didn't bask in it. She simply sat down, folded her hands, and waited for the noise to die. Leslie Creighton, for the first time in her career, looked visibly rattled. She wasn't used to losing control of a room, let alone being publicly outmaneuvered by someone half her age. Her signature smirk had been replaced by a tight-lipped, uncertain stare. Her next cue card trembled slightly in her hand. She looked down at it. Let's, shift topics, she muttered into the mic, but Karoline was already one step ahead. Shift it wherever you want, she said calmly. Just don't expect me to dodge. That line drew a chuckle from the crowd. Then more claps. Karoline hadn't insulted anyone. She hadn't screamed. She'd simply planted herself like a lighthouse and dared the storm to keep spinning. Leslie glanced toward the back of the room, where producers sat with clipboards and panicked eyes. She could see them mouthing something. Likely, end it. Move on. Change the subject. But the story had already changed. A young reporter in the third row stood up. She didn't have a mic, but she spoke anyway. Miss Leavitt, she said, what would you say to people who believe that calling out the media is dangerous, that it creates mistrust in institutions we depend on? Karoline turned toward her, eyes sharp but kind. I'd say this, she began. A strong institution can handle criticism. A broken one fears it. She paused. Mistrust doesn't begin with the people asking questions. It begins with the answers that keep changing. The room went silent again, not out of shock this time, but respect. It wasn't just conservatives clapping now. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny what they were witnessing. This wasn't a meltdown. This was a moment. Leslie tried again. But don't you worry about misinformation, about giving people the wrong impression of journalists? Karoline looked straight at her. No venom, no sarcasm, just truth. I worry about propaganda being sold as journalism, she replied, and I worry about people being too afraid to say so. She looked at the crowd. But mostly I worry about a country where silence is seen as polite and truth is seen as offensive. That was it. A roar of applause. Standing ovation again. Chance now. Let her speak. Let her speak. The forum wasn't supposed to be like this. It was a scheduled discussion, not a public reckoning. But something had shifted in the air. The crowd didn't want spin anymore. They wanted more. And Karoline was just getting started. Cameras were still rolling, but the script was gone. The forum's producer, a man named Jared Alston, who had been running high-profile panels for over a decade, leaned into his headset backstage and whispered, "We've lost the format." He paused. "But we haven't lost the audience." In fact, they had more viewers than ever. The livestream counter had jumped from 30,000 to nearly 250,000 in less than 15 minutes. Clips were already flooding X, formerly Twitter, with hashtags like Karoline Unfiltered and She Said What We Think trending at light speed. Karoline sat calmly, completely unfazed by the chaos erupting outside the forum walls. Leslie, flustered but trying to mask it behind forced poise, glanced back at her next card, only to discard it. "There's been some criticism," Leslie began cautiously, "that voices like yours only stir division, that you prioritize confrontation over consensus. Would you care to respond to that?" Karoline leaned forward. "Division?" she repeated. "Division doesn't start when someone speaks truth. It starts when truth becomes uncomfortable." She looked around the room. For years, Americans were told they were dividing the country just by asking questions. Parents, veterans, small business owners, Christians, cops, even teachers, all told to sit down and trust the system. But you can't demand trust and deny accountability. The audience held their breath. Karoline continued, "I don't speak to divide. I speak to wake people up. Because pretending we're united while being muzzled isn't unity. It's a performance." A soft gasp swept through the back row. A young man mouthed "wow" as he typed furiously on his laptop. "You say I stir confrontation," she said, now turning to Leslie with a calm smile. "Maybe, but if the truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't the truth." And there it was. The crowd erupted. Some in the press section stood up. Not to leave, but to applaud. They were journalists, yes, but also citizens. And something about Karoline's clarity, her refusal to play the game, was cutting past ideology. For a moment, Leslie said nothing. Her next words had to be calculated. Her reputation, built on sharp questions and snarky edits, was now on the line. She looked at Karoline, then at the crowd, then back at Karoline, and for the first time in the entire event, she asked a real question. "No spin, just honest curiosity," Leslie said quietly. "What do you want this country to become?" Karoline sat still. Then she picked up the microphone again, slowly, deliberately. "I want it to be brave again." The silence that followed was electric. Not a word, not a shuffle, not a cough, just stillness. Then, all at once, a third standing ovation. And this one lasted even longer than the last. Cameras zoomed in. Commentators online typed phrases like career-defining moment, and Leavitt just went national. Even pundits who previously dismissed her as a talking point machine now scrambled to shift their tone. Karoline sat back down. The floodgates had opened, and the reporter who was supposed to corner her now looked like she had been standing in front of a freight train. Backstage, the forum director gave up trying to regain control. "Let it ride," he told the crew. "This isn't a panel anymore. It's history." Inside the hall, people were standing shoulder to shoulder in the back aisles, attendees who had given up their seats just to film what was unfolding. The fire marshal, who had been called earlier due to capacity issues, now stood mesmerized like everyone else. And Karoline? Karoline hadn't moved. She hadn't changed tone. She didn't even sip her water, because she didn't need to. Leslie finally spoke again, but her voice had changed. Gone was the rehearsed authority, the high-ground tone. She was slower now, careful. "You said you want the country to be brave again," she repeated. "But what does that mean, practically, in real terms?" Karoline smiled slightly, not smug, just steady. "It means courage in small places," she said. "It means telling the truth, even if your job depends on staying quiet. It means teachers who still teach facts, not feelings. It means soldiers who know they won't be betrayed by the country they serve. And yes, it means journalists who don't edit integrity out of a headline." The camera panned over the crowd. Some wiped their eyes, some smiled, some simply stood still, as if afraid moving would break the moment. Karoline continued. Bravery isn't loud. It's not always flashy. Sometimes it's just one mother at a school board meeting, one dad refusing to shut up at the city council, one freshman in college pushing back when the professor says, "Sit down, you're privileged." She paused. And sometimes bravery is saying what no one else will in a room full of cameras. The crowd clapped again, slower this time, like a wave of gratitude instead of excitement. It felt less like applause and more like agreement. Then came the turning point no one expected. A man in the audience, mid-40s, greying hair, clearly a press badge clipped to his belt, slowly raised his hand. Leslie looked confused. This wasn't the format for questions from the audience. But the crowd instinctively went quiet. The man didn't wait for permission. He stood. "My name is David. I've been a reporter for 20 years, and I just want to say..." He stopped, voice cracking slightly. "I don't agree with everything you say, but I think you're right. We've been editing integrity out of the headline. I've seen it. I've done it." The crowd gasped. Some journalists looked away. David turned to the others. "You all know we've done it." Silence. Thick. Heavy. Then, unexpectedly, a few other reporters began to stand, one by one. Not everyone, but enough to matter. Karoline looked around. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile in triumph. She just nodded, once as if to say thank you. And then she said, "This was never about left or right. It was about truth. And truth isn't partisan. It's just patient until someone's finally brave enough to say it." Leslie had no words left. None were needed. The crowd stood again, and this time they didn't sit back down. By now, the panel was effectively over, at least in structure. The cue cards were untouched, the talking points had been abandoned. Even the stage timer, once used to cut off speakers, had been unplugged. Something rare was happening. A public moment not manufactured by media, not massaged by consultants, not polished for post-production. It was raw, and it was real. Leslie Creighton adjusted her earpiece. "We're, technically out of time," she said, glancing at the crew. But no one moved. The staff wasn't giving signals anymore. They were watching just like everyone else, as citizens. Karoline looked across the sea of faces. Dozens of phones were aimed at her, but she didn't play to the camera. She spoke like she was still just in a room of neighbours, not a national broadcast. "There's something I need to say before this ends," she began, setting her notepad aside. "I've worked in politics. I've been called names. I've been told to stay quiet, smile, and play nice." Her voice sharpened. "And every time I did, I watched the people I was supposed to serve, you, get talked down to, misrepresented, mocked, labelled." She took a deep breath. "I sat in back rooms while media consultants debated whether Americans were smart enough to handle certain truths. I've heard producers laugh at Middle America, call your churches backward, your values outdated, your patriotism performative." Gasps rippled across the room. And then they told me I was the radical. The room tensed. She leaned closer to the mic. "If believing in this country makes me a radical, then I'll wear that label proudly." Applause. Then something new, a chant. "USA, USA, USA!" It started small, but it grew. The kind of chant you only hear at sporting events or 4th of July parades. And now, in the most unexpected of places, a media forum. Leslie looked shell-shocked. This wasn't supposed to happen. She glanced down at her prepared closer, a paragraph meant to pivot the conversation back to media ethics and online regulation. She never read it. Instead, she turned to Karoline and said quietly, "You've changed this room." Karoline responded with just 6 words. No, the room just remembered itself. Even Leslie nodded. Reporters were no longer furiously scribbling quotes. They were listening. One even lowered his camera and clapped with both hands. Backstage, a producer checked the live stream numbers again. Over 1.1 million viewers. The chat was flooded with things like, "We needed this. She just said what no one else will. This isn't a speech, it's a mirror." People watching at home weren't just sharing clips, they were screen recording entire segments in case they got taken down. It wasn't just viral, it was untouchable. Karoline stood slowly, microphone still in hand. And then she said the line that would soon be etched into headlines, coffee mugs and campaign ads across the country. "You can try to cancel a voice, but you can't cancel the truth." It was over, but no one moved. They stood, they clapped. Some wept, some just held their phones in stunned silence. And backstage, a young intern whispered to his supervisor, "This just became American history." By the time Karoline stepped off stage, the forum hall was in chaos, not from panic, but from purpose. Reporters shouted questions not out of hostility, but hunger. Cameramen jostled for position. Influencers, pundits, and even former critics were scrambling to post their reactions online before the moment slipped through their fingers. But the moment wasn't slipping. It was multiplying. By noon, the clip of Karoline saying, "You can try to cancel a voice, but you can't cancel the truth," had hit 4 million views. By 3 p.m., it had crossed 10 million, trending simultaneously on YouTube, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Major news outlets, unsure how to frame it, settled for the safest headline they could muster. Karoline Leavitt sparks debate at media forum. But the people knew what they'd seen. This wasn't a debate. It was a declaration. That night, media segments tried to dissect it, some praising, some panicking. But no analysis could capture the feeling in the room when Karoline spoke without a teleprompter and turned a setup into a sermon. Politicians noticed. So did donors. So did millions of Americans who had never heard Karoline's name before that morning. And while the pundits spun, Karoline didn't tweet. She didn't post. She didn't bask. She boarded a flight back to New Hampshire that evening, sat by the window, and answered one email from her dad that read simply, "You didn't just speak for yourself today. You spoke for every American who's been told to sit down and shut up." She stared at the message for a long time. At a gas station in Iowa, a grandmother who'd never followed politics replayed Karoline's speech 3 times on her phone and told her bridge club that girl just brought truth back into fashion. At a college in Ohio, a liberal professor showed the clip to his media ethics class, not to critique it, but to admit, we need to listen more and label less. And in the MSNBC control room, Leslie Creighton sat alone at her desk long after the broadcast ended, watching the footage in silence. She didn't speak to her producer. She didn't scroll through backlash or praise. She just whispered to herself, she wasn't performing. She was free. And that's what scared them most. Karoline had changed the conversation. Not by yelling, not by shaming, not by branding, but by refusing to blink. The morning after, the Washington Post ran a headline it had probably never expected to publish. Unscripted, unshaken, unstoppable. Karoline Leavitt's moment echoes nationwide. But even that didn't do it justice. This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. The morning after the forum, America didn't just wake up. It leaned forward. Cable news anchors scrambled for a new tone. Left-leaning outlets called it a masterclass in populist communication. Centre-right commentators called it the best media confrontation since Reagan's debate with the press corps. But among everyday people, teachers, truck drivers, moms, students, factory workers, there was no debate. It was the quote, "I don't cherry-pick. I just read aloud what you won't." It was everywhere, on bumper stickers, T-shirts, TikToks. It even became the intro to a new podcast titled Mic'd Up, Voices They Tried to Silence. And within 48 hours, Karoline Leavitt had gone from recognizable name in conservative circles to national wildfire. But what came next surprised everyone. She didn't do the Sunday shows. She didn't post a victory lap thread on X. She didn't call for donations or book a speaking tour. Instead, she released a 3-minute video recorded from her living room. No makeup, no flag backdrop, just honesty. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about you. About the millions of Americans who felt like their values were mocked, their voices dismissed, their laughed at. You don't need a stage to matter. You just need the truth and the guts to speak it." The video closed with her now famous line, "You can try to cancel a voice, but you can't cancel the truth." It hit 20 million views in a day, but not everyone was cheering. Within hours, old hit pieces resurfaced. Anonymous sources came forward. Fact-checkers rushed to dissect her statements. A few late-night hosts mocked her as just another firebrand. Editorial boards labelled her dangerous and divisive. But this time, none of it stuck. Because something had changed in the American audience. They had watched it unfold themselves. They didn't need intermediaries anymore. In fact, someone uploaded the full, uncut forum to YouTube with the title, "Watch What They Tried to Edit Out, Full Karoline Leavitt Forum Moment." Within hours, it overtook most network-produced clips in views and likes. People weren't waiting for narrative. They were chasing raw. And Karoline? She went silent for 2 full days. No press, no posts, nothing. Until a simple black image appeared on her accounts with 1 sentence in white letters. If you heard the silence, you're not alone. The cross-examination project is coming. No logo, no date, no explanation. But it didn't matter. The movement had already begun. 1 week later, the country was still talking. Cable panels couldn't agree on whether Karoline Leavitt was a threat to the establishment or its antidote. Colleges held emergency media literacy roundtables. Activist influencers tried to provoke her into saying something extreme, but she wasn't playing by their script. And then came the launch. No stadium, no massive ad campaign, no super PAC, just 1 stream, broadcast live on YouTube, Rumble and Instagram at once. A minimalist black screen and Karoline's voice. You asked what's next, she began. Not a campaign, not a party, not a platform for me, a platform for you. The logo faded in, the cross-examination project. Underneath it, we asked the questions they won't. Karoline appeared on screen. No podium, no studio lights, just her. In a plain grey turtleneck, sitting at a desk. Behind her were case files, sealed envelopes, stacks of redacted reports. We're going to investigate censorship, smears, gaslighting, from both sides, from media, from government, from institutions that forgot who they serve. She paused. We won't sell your data. We won't sell your anger. We're not here to make you mad. We're here to make you see. She held up a file. No labels, no hashtags. This was sent anonymously by a former federal contractor. It details exactly how stories were throttled during the pandemic, not by bots, but by editors. Human ones. The chat exploded. Viewers across platforms flooded in. Within minutes, servers lagged from the demand. Karoline smiled. We'll be releasing everything, unedited. No commentary, no spin, just facts. She leaned forward. They tried to corner me with a question, and instead they gave me a spotlight. But this isn't about lighting me up. It's about lighting the whole system. A final message flashed across the screen. This isn't a revolution. It's a reveal. And then, nothing. The feed ended. But the ripple was instant. Major networks ran emergency coverage. Government watchdogs scrambled. Whistleblowers began contacting the project anonymously. Tech companies held closed-door meetings. And the people? They didn't wait. Clips flooded timelines. Neighborhoods hosted cross-examination meetups. Podcasts dissected her words line by line. Even critics were forced to admit this wasn't politics as usual. It was something else. Karoline didn't just slam a reporter. She didn't just go viral. She turned 1 quote into a cultural mirror. And as millions shared the moment where she calmly said, I don't cherry-pick. I just read aloud what you won't. Something extraordinary happened. People stopped waiting to be spoken for. They began speaking for themselves.